7 years sailing around the world, we realised that we'd only sailed a small part of our home country. So this season, we set off to put that right, by sailing around the British Isles.
Our 5-month, 2,426-mile journey took us to some of the most beautiful and remote parts of the UK, including rounding the top of Shetland and sailing out to the isolated island of St Kilda.
In this video, we'll take a look back at the highlights of our voyage around Britain, and then share a closer look at the reality and challenges of making this voyage.
At the start of this season, Florence was still in a shed on the south coast of the UK near Portsmouth. We were late setting off. Our 6-month winter refit had turned into 8 months, despite us working every waking hour to try and get Florence back into the water.
That meant that we had a much shorter sailing season than we'd intended, but we still wanted to make the most of it, and so we set ourselves the goal of sailing around the British Isles. And the British Isles have 31,000 kilometres of coastline and are also known for their challenging tides and weather.
A couple of hours after we finished the last job of our winter refit, we set out for a shakedown sail in Solent. But the idea was, if that went successfully, we would just keep on going.
Can't tell you how good it feels to be out here. There's no turning back. We're actually going to head out of the Solent, head east and along the south coast of the UK. We're going to try and make as much progress as we can whilst the weather is really good. And so we better get into, I guess, the routine of sailing again.
Leaving Portsmouth at the end of May, we were far later than we had hoped to be. We were desperate to make the most of the summer months in the Scottish Islands, but faced headwinds in the North Sea, making progress difficult. So whenever the wind did turn in our favour, we grabbed the opportunity to make miles north with longer overnight passages.
I think this is why they call it the wash. It is definitely like a washing machine.
Well done.
Yay.
Made it to Scotland. Do you want a cup of tea?
I would love a cup of tea and sleep for about a week.
It feels amazing to have Florence at anchor in a beautiful remote island once more. This is what we live for. This is why we do this. And this is it just feels awesome to be here.
It's magic, and these puffins are absolutely gorgeous.
gale force 8, backing southwesterly soon. Marlin, Hebrides, gale now ceased, but southwesterly, gale force 8 expected soon.
That one in front of us might be worth job. Yeah, it's got pretty breezy.
Looking back, we certainly feel that sailing around Britain allowed us to make the most of our shorter than usual sailing season.
So now we're going to take a look back at the route we took and why, our favourite places around the UK, the biggest challenges we faced and how it was different compared to sailing around the world, and then we'll finish with our top tips for sailing around Britain. To sail around the UK, the consensus on the best route is actually to go up the west coast and back down the west coast again, and that's because the majority of the most beautiful scenic anchorages are on the west coast. There's far more anchorages on that side, but we really wanted to go around and complete a circumnavigation. So we were choosing between anti-clockwise and clockwise. Comparing the winds and the currents, there's a fractional advantage from the current to going clockwise, but it's so small it really is negligible. But the biggest factor for us was that we were already late in the season and we wanted to make the most of the summer months up in the Scottish Islands. So we wanted to get up there fairly rapidly. So we chose to go anti-clockwise. There are less places to stop really on the east coast of the UK. So we would go pretty quick up the east coast, spend our time in the Scottish Islands and then come back down the west coast, gradually exploring as we went. So when we left, as I say, we're already late in the season. We set out from Portsmouth Harbour and we were straight into an overnight sail along to Ramsgate. When we got to Ramsgate, we faced strong northerly winds, so we were actually stuck there for 5 days before a weather window appeared to go further north. We crossed the Thames estuary in a pretty big day hop. Most boats stopped a couple of places on the way. We went direct from Ramsgate to Lowestoft. We stopped there just for one night to allow the wind over tide conditions off the corner of Norfolk to get a bit better for the next day before we sailed on. And then we went overnight from there to Whitby, so we were already pretty quick. But there we got stuck for 7 days in Whitby with strong northerly winds, and then when the weather finally relented and gave us a southerly, albeit one gusting to 30 knots, we decided to make the absolute most of it and get as far as we could with the wind blowing from behind. So we actually did 248 miles from Whitby to Wick all in one shot, which was 2 nights at sea, and that was the longest passage of the circumnavigation.
From Wick we kicked off to Fair Isle and the rest of Shetland, and at this point in the trip our passages were becoming much shorter. We were able to mostly make day sails rather than overnight passages because the anchorages were much closer together and there were many more of them. We managed to circumnavigate the Isles of Shetland around the very top past Muckleflugger Lighthouse, and then it was just a day sail from Shetland to Orkney. But then from Orkney we sailed overnight past Cape Wrath to the Outer Hebrides on the west coast of Scotland. And in the west coast of Scotland, this is where we concentrated most of our time. We spent over 2 months sailing the islands in this area, and that was partly because of the number of anchorages that were available, but also partly because the weather was so terrible. Throughout the month of August, it was pretty much gale warning after gale warning. And so when we finally made it out to St Kilda and back, it was getting to late September before we started making our way further south through the last of the islands in Scotland.
So by this point it was fairly late in the season and we're level with about the top of Northern Ireland there. So we're making a decision as to whether we would come down the Irish Sea or go round the outside of Ireland. Ultimately there were 2 main factors that drove our decision. Because we were late in the season, you can get a lot of bad weather on the west coast of Ireland, and at that point in time we had a really nice northeasterly breeze which would forecast to allow us to sail downwind down the Irish Sea in ideal conditions. So we set off for a really fast sail down to the Isle of Man. We were able to enjoy for a couple of days, and then we wanted to stop in at Dublin in Ireland, but the weather forecast was changing and showing us that if we did stop in there we only had 24 hours before we had to move on, or we were likely to be stuck there for a significant period of time by strong winds. So we decided that we just make use of the good winds to get as far south as we could, and we stopped in at Milford Haven on the south coast of Wales, where we did wait out a gale which gusted to 61 knots in the Irish Sea. But after that we got a beautiful weather window which we weren't expecting in October, which allowed us to spend 2 days in the beautiful Isles of Scilly before we day hopped our way back along the south coast to our home base in Portsmouth. Overall we sailed 2,426 miles around the UK and we were away for 144 days from June until October.
And we spent 10 nights at sea, and part of that reason was because we wanted to make fast progress both up the east coast and then again fast progress down the Irish Sea towards the end of the season. But it's perfectly normal to sail around Britain without any overnight passages. It's just what works well for us because we wanted to make decent progress and some bigger hops, but also because our sailing background is mostly ocean sailing, and so it's, I wouldn't say easy for us to go into an overnight passage, but it is certainly normal and it doesn't take us long to pick up an overnight watch routine. We made 59 stops in total and spent 96 nights at anchor and 38 nights in a marina. And that's a much higher number of nights at anchor than the average trip around Britain. And again, it's just what we're used to. We really enjoy remote anchorages and are used to living at anchor. And it's also because we spent so much of our time on the west coast of Scotland, which has so many amazing remote anchorages.
Overall, we did 66 engine hours, and I'm sure if you follow our videos, you know that we really don't like motoring. So we would rather wait until the wind is blowing to sail somewhere rather than motor there. I think this is a much lower figure than most boats normally sailing around the UK. And those engine hours we did do were spent motoring up, exploring locks and places where it was either way too narrow or the tide was too strong for us to be able to sail up in those places. And also because we have our solar panels, we don't use the engine to charge the batteries at all. And I think the last stat there was gale warnings, and we honestly lost count of the number of gale warnings.
So moving on to our favourite places. And as a whole, our favourite places were Shetland and then the islands off the west coast of Scotland. But to pick out some specific places, the very first one has to be Fair Isle. And not only was this our first remote island that we stopped in the trip, but it was also our first anchorage, because in 581 miles sailing up the east coast, we'd so far only been able to stop in marinas. And not only was Fair Isle a spectacular island, it also had a very friendly island, small island community, and it was the first up-close encounter that we had with puffins.
The puffins were the main highlight of our trip around the UK, and we got the chance to see them up close and personal in the Shant Islands, which are a group of uninhabited islands in the Minch Sea area between the Outer Hebrides and mainland Scotland. And there are literally tens of thousands of puffins and seabirds. And as we were taking photos of them, they were almost inquisitive towards us, and they just sit on the rock in front of us having a look. They were really almost tame, but there were so many of them there circling that you could hear the puffin poo pattering down on the water around us, and we and Florence were completely covered in puffin poo by the time we left.
In terms of scenery, some of the remote anchorages on the islands of the Outer Hebrides are hard to beat, especially when the sun is shining. Some of our standout favourites were the islands of Sandray, Taransay and also Scarp. With their crystal clear waters and white sand beaches, they rival the Caribbean, but without the need to jostle with other boats for anchorage space. In fact, we often had anchorages like this to ourselves. The main reason for that, of course, is the weather, as very few of the days were this calm and sunny. These anchorages are also much more exposed and further away from the main yachting centres. But when we reached a more remote anchorage and the sun shone, it felt even more special.
Talking about our favourite places on the trip, we can't not mention St Kilda. But it's not really a favourite place for the island itself, although it was absolutely beautiful. It was more to do with the challenge of getting there. Sailing out to the island of St Kilda is on the bucket list of most sailors when sailing around the UK, and that is because it is often so difficult to get there, so difficult to find a weather window that it's possible to sail there and get ashore. And we were really fortunate to get a beautiful, short weather window that we could explore the place in stunning weather. But then the fog just came back in, which made the challenge of getting back to the Outer Hebrides equal to getting out to St Kilda itself in the first place. So talking about challenges, it is well known that the two greatest challenges of sailing around the UK are the weather and the tides. And the tides can be particularly dangerous because it can be so strong that in many places they can run faster than Florence can sail or motor. And when you get strong wind against tide, you can set up very steep, choppy seas, which can be dangerous for a small boat like Florence. So we needed to pay attention. Our first piece of information, or first port of call for information for the tides, was an old almanac which has all the tidal flows for around the UK in the back of it. And then we would also use Predict Wind to double check on those. And tools like Predict Wind can give you a routing to make optimum use of the tides, but we often ignored that routing. So the one I'm showing you here on the screen was for when we were going through the Orkney Islands from Shetland to West Orkney. And the routing suggested we went through the middle of the islands to make the most of the strong currents that would be in our favour at particular points. In reality, trying to aim to hit those particular points at those exact times to make the most of those tides would have been difficult, and we could have ended up with 6 knots of tide against us. So instead, we looked at that and we thought we'd just take the safer option of going around the top of Orkney and coming in from the other side, so we didn't have to deal with the extreme tides through the narrow gaps between the islands. But there's another passage where we were at the top of Shetland and we were trying to just do a 10-mile passage just round to another anchorage, and we read the pilot guide for it, and it did worry us, because if you read these pilot guides it can sound like a really scary passage. So I'll read you the passage that worried us from this guide. It says, confused seas are experienced most of the time, and with a north-going stream the roost is particularly dangerous. Now, a roost is a Scottish term for tidal overfalls. Even in moderate weather, this whole area should be given a berth of at least 3 miles, and fishing boats avoid the roost by keeping close in, but that shouldn't be attempted without local knowledge. So that really worried us, and we took all the precautions we thought we could.
We had another early start this morning, but it's not because we are going a great distance today. It was just to get the right state of tide, and whilst the wind was still light, to get around this headland, because there's supposed to be really bad tidal overfalls, or a Scottish roost, which runs all around this area, and you're supposed to actually go 3 miles offshore. But we've headed out this morning, and because the wind and the tide are correct, it is as flat as a pancake. So we're just cutting straight inshore, and yeah, we'll be there in a couple of hours.
So although a lot of the passages sound bad, because they can be, they don't have to be dangerous if you get them at the right stage of tide and wind. We found the difficulty with the tides was more in the planning than actually facing any difficult conditions at sea. So much so that we don't actually have any footage of the tides and the weather in the wrong conditions, because we avoided those situations completely.
The weather proved to be a much bigger challenge than the tides, and it was rare for us to hear a forecast on the VHF radio that didn't include a gale warning. But it is worth bearing in mind that the summer that we were sailing, and especially the time that we were in Scotland, was deemed by the locals as the worst summer that they could remember in terms of wind and rain. And despite that weather, we didn't have to be out sailing in those conditions, because we could generally plan around it. We spent a lot of time reviewing a weather forecast and re-looking at the weather forecast, and then choosing a sheltered anchorage to wait out that weather. And we spent a lot of time in those sheltered anchorages waiting out the weather. We only got caught out by bad weather once on the east coast of Skye, when we didn't move to a more protected anchorage in time.
That one in front of us might be worth the odds.
We've been lulled into thinking that the wind wouldn't be as bad as forecast, because the system came in later than predicted, and we'd already been stuck on board for a few days, and so we took the risk to stay in a less protected anchorage in the hope that we'd be able to get ashore for a walk later in the day. But we soon regretted that decision, because the system came in hard, and we were then faced with moving down the coast to a more protected anchorage with 45 knot downdrafts. And what you don't see in that video is that it had become too windy to get the dinghy up onto the deck. And so we were faced with towing the dinghy, and we nearly lost it. But we were just not filming, because we were concentrating on getting to that next anchorage, which was only 6 miles away, safely.
The weather was also colder than we expected. Up in Shetland, in the height of midsummer, it was only 9 degrees, and we were wearing down jackets, fleeces, beanie hats, and we were really grateful for the insulation that we'd added during the refit and our new heater. And by comparison, by the time we got back down to the south coast late in October, it was warmer in October on the south coast than it had been in the height of summer up in Scotland. So moving on to another question we get asked a lot, which is how did sailing around Britain compare with sailing around the world? Well, this year sailing around Britain, we obviously haven't crossed an ocean, and the distances between anchorages are much closer. So although we sailed 2,426 miles, we actually spent a lot of that time sailing together in the cockpit, which is very rare for us. Normally, one person is down below either sleeping or resting, and the other person is sailing the boat solo. But this time, because we were doing mostly day hops and sleeping comfortably, well, not quite so comfortably in the gales, but sleeping on during the nights, we spent a lot more time sailing the boat together.
There's a lot more information available for sailing around the UK than we've had access to for sailing around the world. And in fact, the number of pilot guides that we had for our trip around Britain far outweighed the amount of information that we had for our entire Pacific crossing, including all of the islands that we visited. And although all of that information is time consuming to read, it did make our lives a huge amount easier in terms of planning and also finding places to shelter when the weather was bad. Generally, living on board was much easier sailing around Britain because there are so many more marinas available. And so whenever we needed to do our laundry, stock up with food, gas or fuel, we could just pull into a marina and complete all of those chores. So it was less time consuming and much easier. There was certainly no doing the washing in the dinghy on our trip around Britain.
We would also say that there is far less need to be self-sufficient when sailing around the UK. If you have a breakage, then there are so many places you can pull into, small towns or marinas, to get help to fix it. And if you need a spare part, that part should be able to be delivered within 2 or 3 days at the worst case, even to the outer islands. So we were a lot less worried or stressed about parts breaking. Compare that to being in the middle of the Pacific, where you need all of the spare parts you could possibly think of on board, and you're going to have to fix it yourself. And also food. We were never far from a large grocery store. There was no need for us to bake our own bread on board. In fact, the longest we went between large grocery store shops was probably 3 weeks, and that was because we were in the remote islands of the Outer Hebrides and we just chose to be out there instead of spending the time to sail back to a larger supermarket. In fact, the quality, availability and price of food, even in the remote islands of the UK, was far better than we found in most of the rest of the world.
Oh, thanks very much. That was a bit better than normal.
Moving on to our top tips for sailing around Britain. And when we thought these through, we realised that most of them are also applicable to any long sailing journey. And the first is to do with dealing with the tides and the weather. A lot of passages, as you read about them, can sound scary, and that's because they can be dangerous in the wrong conditions. But with careful planning, if you get the tide in your favour and the wind in your favour, that same passage can turn out to be an enjoyable sail. The second tip is about the way we go about planning. We don't try to plan the entire trip in detail from the start. We do overall planning long term, but detail planning short term. For example, when we sail around Britain, we had an overall plan to sail up the east coast, to spend the bulk of the summer months up in the Scottish Islands, and then to return in the autumn down the west coast. The detailed planning about which islands we would visit or which anchorages we would stop in was actually only done a few days beforehand when we had a weather forecast for that area. And we tried to go to bed each evening with a plan already in place for the following day, in case we need to get up at dawn to make the most of the tide. And then when we get up in the morning, we double check the weather forecast to make sure it's still a valid plan before we go ahead with it.
And our third tip is that time is your biggest friend or your best resource, and to allow as much time as you possibly can for a trip, because that allows you to wait out any bad weather and not be forced into sailing in the wrong conditions on some of the more challenging passages. And our fourth and final tip is to be as flexible as possible and try not to have your heart set on visiting certain places, because as Matt mentioned, the weather might not always allow that. But also to be avoiding pinned down to being in a certain place at a certain date, because again that forces you to sail in potentially bad conditions. So in summary, we had a fantastic sail around Britain. We saw some incredible scenery and some amazing wildlife, and our only regret is that we didn't set off sooner and have more time to explore.
We've had a lot of questions about all the work that we did on Florence during the refit, and of course the big one, was all that blood, sweat and tears worth it? So in the next video we'll have a review of all the changes and upgrades that we made to Florence and how they changed our life on board over 5 months and 2,426 miles of sailing. Continuing our voyage on Florence would not be possible without the support of our patrons. Thank you to all of you, and especially to our star patrons.
For extra updates in between these bi-weekly videos, and to find out what we're up to in real time, head over to Patreon and join the crew. Of course, don't forget to subscribe to make sure that you don't miss the next episode here on YouTube.